In 2007, one company sold more than half of the smartphones on planet Earth. Not a quarter, not a third, more than half. For every smartphone made by every other manufacturer on the planet, combined, this one company sold more. Its phones were everywhere. In the hands of presidents and farmers, in the pockets of teenagers in Helsinki, and businessmen in Tokyo, and street vendors in Lagos. Its brand was, for a time, the most valuable in all of Europe and one of the most recognized in the world. It had taken a small, obscure company from a freezing country of 5 million people and turned it into the undisputed king of the most important consumer product of the modern age. The company was Nokia, and in 2007, it stood at the absolute summit of the mobile world, looking down at everyone. 6 years later, it sold its entire phone business to Microsoft in a deal of desperation. The king of mobile, the company that had defined the cell phone for an entire generation, simply handed over the crown and walked away. Tens of thousands of jobs gone. A national champion humbled. A brand that had meant the future, now meaning the past. What happened in those 6 years is one of the fastest and most complete collapses in the history of business. A company does not usually fall from the very top of the world to surrender in barely half a decade. Empires take time to crumble. Nokia did it almost overnight. And here is the part that should disturb every leader who hears it. Nokia was not killed by a technology it failed to see. Nokia saw the smartphone revolution perfectly. It had, in fact, helped invent it. Nokia had touchscreens, app stores, and internet-connected phones in development or on the market years before the iPhone existed. Nokia was not killed by a lack of options either. When the ground began to shift, Nokia was offered a clear path to survival, a path that several of its competitors took and that saved them: Android. And Nokia said no. This is the story of how the most dominant company in the history of mobile phones looked at the lifeboat, understood exactly what it was, and chose to step past it onto a sinking platform instead. This is not the story of a company that was beaten by a better product. This is the story of a company that was offered survival and turned it down. My name is unimportant. What matters is the body on the table. And today, the body is Nokia. Let's begin the autopsy. To understand how shocking Nokia's fall truly was, you have to understand how improbable its rise had been. Nokia did not begin as a technology company. It did not begin as a phone company. It began, of all things, as a paper mill, founded in 1865 in a small town in Finland. For its first century of existence, Nokia made paper, then rubber, then cables. It made rubber boots. It made tires. It made gas masks and electrical wire. It was a sprawling, unglamorous industrial conglomerate at the edge of the Arctic, the kind of company nobody outside Finland had any reason to think about. And then, in the latter half of the 20th century, Nokia made a series of bets that would transform it completely. It moved into electronics. It moved into telecommunications. And in the 1980s and 90s, as the world stood on the edge of the mobile revolution, Nokia made the boldest decision in its history. It shed the boots and the cables and the tires, and it bet the entire company on one idea: the mobile phone. It was a staggering gamble, and it paid off beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Nokia rode the explosion of mobile telephony in the 1990s like no other company on Earth. As the world went mobile, Nokia was there, with the right products at the right moment, and a manufacturing and logistics machine that could flood the planet with handsets. And Nokia understood something its rivals did not. It understood that a phone was not just a piece of technology. It was a personal object. It had to feel good in the hand. It had to be reliable. It had to be simple. Nokia phones were legendary for their durability. There are jokes, to this day, about the indestructible Nokia brick that survives drops, floods, and falls that would shatter any modern phone. They were intuitive. They were beautiful in their simplicity. And they came in 1,000 varieties, for every taste and every budget, in every corner of the world. By the early 2000s, Nokia was not merely a market leader, it was the market. At its peak, Nokia commanded around 40% of all mobile phone sales on the entire planet. 40%. In an industry with dozens of competitors, nearly half of all the phones sold in the world had Nokia's name on them. Consider a single product to grasp the scale. The Nokia 1100, a simple, cheap, durable handset, became one of the best-selling consumer electronic devices in the history of the world, selling on the order of 250 million units. Not $250 million. 250 million phones. One model. There are few products in any category, ever, that have reached that many human hands. Nokia did it almost casually, as one of countless models in a lineup that blanketed every price point and every region on Earth. It was, by some measures, the most valuable company in Europe. It single-handedly transformed the Finnish economy, at one point accounting for an enormous share of the nation's entire economic growth and a huge portion of its stock market value. A small Nordic country became a technology superpower on the back of one company. Children in Finland grew up assuming they would work for Nokia, the way children in Rochester once assumed they would work for Kodak. And inside the company, a particular culture had taken root, the culture of the engineer king. Nokia was run, at its heart, by hardware people, brilliant ones. People who knew how to make a radio antenna sing, how to squeeze a week of battery life out of a tiny cell, how to build a phone that could survive a fall onto concrete. This expertise had built the empire, and it had also built a worldview that the essence of a phone was the device in your hand, the physical object, the hardware. It was a worldview that had been correct for 20 years. It was about to become the most dangerous assumption in the company. This was the summit, and from the summit, the view is intoxicating. Nokia looked out across the mobile world and saw a kingdom it had built and ruled completely. And this is exactly the moment, as it always is, when the fatal weakness begins to grow, not in the years of struggle, in the years of triumph. Dominance does not just bring profit. It brings something far more dangerous. It brings the certainty that you are right, the deep, unspoken, organizational belief that the way you do things is the way things should be done, because look how well it has worked. Nokia was about to learn that the market can take back its crown far faster than it gave it. For years, Nokia's dominance seemed unbreakable, and the company's engineers were genuinely brilliant. In fact, And this is the first great irony of the autopsy. Nokia was not behind on the technology of the future. In many ways, it was ahead. Long before the iPhone, Nokia had explored touchscreen phones. It had developed internet-capable devices. It had, in its research labs, prototypes and concepts for many of the features that would later define the smartphone era. Nokia engineers had even envisioned something like an app store and tablet-style devices years before such things became mainstream. The talent was there. The vision in pockets of the company was there. So Nokia had the technology, it had the market, it had the brand, the money, the manufacturing, and the global reach. It had every single ingredient required to own the smartphone era as completely as it had owned the era before it. And then, in 2007, a computer company from California that had never made a phone in its life walked onto the stage. When Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone, the initial reaction from much of the established phone industry, including voices within Nokia's world, was skepticism. And on paper, the skepticism had some logic to it. The first iPhone was expensive. Its battery life was poor. It had no physical keyboard, which conventional wisdom said serious users demanded. It worked on only one carrier in one country at launch. By the cold metrics that Nokia used to measure a phone, durability, battery, signal, price, units shipped, the iPhone looked like a fragile, overpriced toy for wealthy enthusiasts. This was the same mistake we have seen on this table before, judging the new thing by the standards of the old thing. Nokia looked at the iPhone and measured it against what a phone had always been. It did not understand that the iPhone was not a better phone. It was a different kind of object entirely, a pocket computer that happened to make calls. The competition was no longer about hardware, about who could make the most durable handset at the best price. The competition had silently shifted to something Nokia barely understood: software, ecosystems, apps, the experience of using the thing. The ground had moved, and Nokia, standing exactly where it had always stood, did not feel it move. But here is what saves this from being a simple story of blindness, and what makes Nokia's death so much more tragic than a mere failure to notice. Nokia did notice. The threat became undeniable. By 2010, it was obvious to everyone, inside and outside the company, that Nokia was in serious trouble. The iPhone was redefining the high end. And on the other side, a new force was rising even faster: Google's Android. Before we follow the body further down, I want to ask you something directly. If you find this kind of autopsy valuable, if you want to understand not just that great companies die, but the exact decision in the exact room that kills them, then subscribe to this channel. Every episode we lay one fallen empire on the table, and we find the true cause of death. It costs you nothing, and it guarantees the next examination finds its way to you. Now, back to the body. To understand Nokia's fatal decision, you have to understand the trap it had built for itself. And that trap had a name: Symbian. Symbian was Nokia's operating system, the software that ran its phones. In the era before the iPhone, Symbian was a triumph. It was powerful, efficient, and ran on a vast range of devices. It powered Nokia's smartphones and helped cement the company's dominance. But Symbian had been designed for a different world, a world of small screens, physical keys, and limited processing power. A world before the touchscreen, before the modern app, before the idea that a phone should be a fluid, finger-driven computer. As the iPhone and Android redefined what a phone's software should feel like, Symbian began to show its age badly. It was difficult for developers to write apps for. It was clunky on touchscreens. Engineers inside Nokia reportedly struggled and strained to bend the aging system to meet the demands of the new era, pouring enormous effort into patching something that was, at its foundation, built for a world that no longer existed. Every month that Nokia spent trying to modernize Symbian was a month its competitors spent racing ahead on software built, from the ground up, for the new reality. So by 2010, Nokia stood at a fork in the road. Its old operating system was failing. The world had changed. And it faced a decision that would determine whether it lived or died. It had, broadly, 3 paths in front of it. The first path was to keep fighting with its own software, to bet on Symbian and on a next-generation system it was developing, and try to build a modern smartphone platform entirely on its own. This was the path of independence, but it meant trying to catch 2 opponents who were already years ahead. The second path was the one that, in hindsight, screams off the page. Adopt Android. Google's operating system was free, modern, designed from the start for touchscreens and apps, and improving at a furious pace. Several other phone makers, Samsung chief among them, were embracing Android, putting it on their hardware and riding it to enormous success. Nokia, with its unmatched manufacturing, its global distribution, its iconic brand, and its hardware expertise, could have done the same. It could have put Android on the best-built phones in the world and potentially become the dominant Android manufacturer on the planet. The lifeboat was right there, in the water, waiting. The third path was to partner with Microsoft and bet the company's future on Windows Phone, a brand new, unproven smartphone operating system with almost no market share and almost no apps. In 2010, Nokia brought in a new chief executive to make this decision. His name was Stephen Elop, and he was a striking choice, because he was the first non-Finn to lead the company. He had come from Microsoft, and in 2011, Stephen Elop made the choice that this entire episode is named for. He looked at the free, modern, surging Android lifeboat, and he stepped past it. He chose to bet the entire future of Nokia on Microsoft's Windows Phone. He said no to Android, and that was fatal. Now, I have to be fair, because a true autopsy does not flatter the prosecution. Elop's reasoning was not insane. It was wrong, catastrophically wrong, but it was not stupid, and understanding why is the whole point of this examination. Elop's central argument against Android was this: if Nokia joined Android, it would become just one of many companies making Android phones. It would be in a crowd, fighting Samsung and a dozen others, all running the same software, all competing mainly on price and hardware, with Google controlling the platform and taking the strategic high ground. In that world, Elop feared, Nokia would lose its ability to differentiate. It would be reduced to a commodity hardware maker, its fat margins crushed, its destiny controlled by Google. He reportedly feared a future where Google and Apple formed a duopoly, and Nokia was left as a servant to one of them. With Windows Phone, the argument went, Nokia could be the dominant partner. It could be the #1 maker of Windows phones from day one, with a special relationship with Microsoft, a differentiated product, and a third ecosystem to rival Apple and Google. Nokia would be a king in a smaller kingdom rather than a peasant in a larger one. On a whiteboard, in a strategy meeting, it almost makes sense. But it rested on a fatal misunderstanding of how the new world actually worked. Because the smartphone war was not, fundamentally, a war between phones. It was a war between ecosystems, and an ecosystem lives or dies on one thing above all others: apps. A smartphone is only as valuable as the things you can do with it, and the things you can do with it are the apps. The apps live where the users are. Developers build apps for the platforms with the most customers, because that is where the money is. And users buy the phones with the most apps, because that is where the usefulness is. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle, a flywheel. More users attract more apps, and more apps attract more users, spinning faster and faster. By 2011, Apple and Android already had that flywheel spinning at tremendous speed. They had hundreds of thousands of apps and hundreds of millions of users, each feeding the other. Windows Phone had almost nothing, almost no users, which meant almost no developers wanted to build for it, which meant almost no apps, which meant almost no reason for users to buy it. Nokia was not picking a smaller kingdom. It was choosing to build a brand new kingdom from scratch, with no citizens, while two established empires next door grew more powerful by the day. And to make the wound deeper, Android was free. Nokia could have had a thriving, modern ecosystem at no cost. Instead, it chose to pour its dwindling resources into propping up a platform almost no one wanted. The lifeboat was free, and Nokia chose to build its own boat, from scratch, in the middle of the storm. But it was not just the choice that killed Nokia. It was how the choice was announced, and this is one of the most extraordinary self-inflicted wounds in all of business history. To understand it, you need to hear about two documents. The first is known, forever now, as the Burning Platform Memo. In early 2011, just before announcing the Microsoft partnership, Stephen Elop sent a memo to all of Nokia's employees. In it, he used a powerful and now legendary metaphor. He compared Nokia to a man standing on a burning oil platform in the freezing sea, forced to choose between the flames and a terrifying leap into the icy water. The message was brutally honest about the company's dire situation. Nokia, he said, was standing on a burning platform, and it had to change, dramatically, to survive. As an internal wake-up call, it was striking. But the memo leaked to the press, as these things always do. And now the entire world, Nokia's customers, partners, and competitors, had been told, in the words of Nokia's own chief executive, that the company was a man standing on a burning platform. Think about the message that's sent to a customer standing in a phone shop. Would you buy a phone from a company whose own leader just publicly declared it was on fire? The second document was the announcement of the strategy itself. In February 2011, Nokia announced it was abandoning its own software future and switching to Windows Phone. But here is the catastrophe. The new Windows phones were not ready. They would not arrive in stores for many months, which meant Nokia had just stood up and told the entire world, the phones we are selling you right now, today, the Symbian phones in the stores, are obsolete and have no future. And the new phones you should actually want, well, those do not exist yet. This created what analysts would later call the Osborne effect, named after a computer company that destroyed itself by announcing a future product so far in advance that everyone stopped buying its current one. Nokia did exactly this, but on a global scale. It announced the death of its own current products before it had anything to replace them. The result was instant and devastating. Sales of Nokia's existing phones did not decline, they collapsed. Why would anyone buy a Symbian phone that its own maker had just declared dead? And why would anyone wait many months for an unproven Windows phone when they could walk into the same shop and buy a fully developed iPhone or Android device today with hundreds of thousands of apps right now? Nokia had announced its own funeral and then asked the world to wait patiently for its rebirth. The world did not wait. It walked next door to Apple and to Android, and it never came back. I want to pause the timeline here, because this is the part of the autopsy that matters most. Not what Nokia did, why it did it. And I promised you that Nokia's why would be different from the giants we have examined before. And it is. Kodak died of love for a profitable past. Blockbuster died of comfort with a profitable present. But Nokia's death has a different character entirely. Nokia died of certainty, of internal rot, and of a single high-stakes bet placed by a single man. Let me show you the three forces that actually killed it. The first force was the arrogance of total dominance. When you control 40% of a market, when your brand is the most valuable on a continent, when an entire nation's prosperity rests on your shoulders, you develop a deep and unspoken belief that you understand your business better than anyone. This is the curse of the king. Nokia had been right for so long and so completely that it could not conceive of being fundamentally wrong. It looked at the iPhone through the eyes of a company that had won every battle for a decade, and it could not take seriously the idea that a computer company with one phone could rewrite the rules of an industry Nokia had built. Dominance does not just make you powerful, it makes you certain, and certainty is the enemy of survival when the world is changing. The second force was internal paralysis and politics. By the time the crisis hit, Nokia had grown into a vast, sprawling organization, and beneath its dominant surface, it was reportedly riddled with internal division, competing fiefdoms, and a culture where bad news struggled to travel upward. Different parts of the company pulled in different directions. Engineers reportedly knew that Symbian was failing and that the next generation software was troubled, but the organization as a whole could not act decisively. A giant that cannot move quickly is helpless when the world demands speed. While Apple moved like a scalpel and Android spread like water, Nokia moved like a committee. The very size that had been its strength in the manufacturing era became a fatal slowness in the software era, where the rules changed every 6 months. The third force was the catastrophic single bet. And this is what makes Nokia unique among our cases. Kodak and Blockbuster died slowly, from 1,000 small refusals over decades. Nokia died from essentially one enormous decision, made at one moment by one man. The choice of Windows Phone over Android was not a gradual drift. It was a deliberate, all-in wager that bet the entire company on a single platform, a platform that turned out to have no future. When you concentrate your survival into one decision like that, you remove all margin for error. If the bet is right, you are saved. If the bet is wrong, there is no second chance, no diversification, no fallback. Nokia put everything on one square of the table, the wheel spun, and the company lost everything in a single turn. Certainty, paralysis, and one fatal bet. That is the specific disease that killed this specific giant. 3 companies, 3 different illnesses, but the same ending. Because the underlying sickness, beneath all the variations, is always the same. It is the failure to honestly confront a changing world while there is still time to change with it. Now, let us watch the king fall. After the Windows Phone decision, the collapse was breathtaking in its speed. The numbers tell a story almost too brutal to believe. Nokia, which had commanded around 40% of the global phone market at its peak, and was the dominant smartphone maker as recently as 2007, watched its market share in smartphones crater into the low single digits within just a few years. Its sales evaporated. Its once legendary profits turned into staggering losses. Its credit rating was slashed to junk. The most valuable brand in Europe was bleeding to death in plain sight. The Windows phones, when they finally arrived, were not bad devices. In fact, the hardware was often praised. Beautifully designed, well built, with excellent cameras. This is the final cruelty. Nokia did its part. It built genuinely good phones, but it did not matter, because the phones ran an operating system that almost no developers supported and almost no customers wanted. A beautiful phone with no apps is like a magnificent stadium with no teams. People do not buy the building. They come for the games, and the games were all being played next door, on Apple and Android. No amount of hardware excellence could overcome the empty ecosystem. Nokia had bet that it could build the third ecosystem, and the market delivered its verdict with merciless clarity. There would be no third ecosystem. There was room for 2, and Nokia had chosen to stand outside both of them. The losses mounted into the billions. The workforce was slashed. Tens of thousands of people who had built their lives and careers around the great Finnish champion lost their jobs. The factories that had flooded the world with phones went quiet. A country that had built a huge part of its modern prosperity on this one company watched, in shock, as its national champion disintegrated. And then, in 2013, came the final indignity. Nokia agreed to sell its entire phone business, the core of the company, the business that had made it world famous, the business that had defined the mobile phone for 1 billion people, to Microsoft. The maker of the operating system that had helped sink it now bought the corpse. Stephen Elop, the man who had come from Microsoft and bet Nokia on Microsoft's software, returned to Microsoft as part of the deal. The king of mobile had surrendered. The crown was gone. And here is the postscript that turns the whole tragedy into something almost unbearable. Microsoft's own phone ambitions failed too. Within a few short years, Microsoft wrote down almost the entire value of the Nokia acquisition, billions of dollars, and essentially abandoned the phone business altogether. The Windows Phone platform that Nokia had bet its life on was killed by its own creator. The bet had been even worse than it looked. Nokia had not just chosen the wrong lifeboat. It had chosen a lifeboat that its own builder would soon set on fire and sink. Everything Nokia gave up its independence for, everything it abandoned Android to chase, was gone within a few years, as if it had never existed. And to feel the full weight of the verdict, you only have to look next door, at the company that made the opposite choice. Samsung, in the same years, faced the same fork in the same road. It too was a hardware company. It too could have tried to build its own software empire, or clung to its own systems. Instead, Samsung embraced Android fully, put it on superb hardware, flooded every price point on Earth, exactly the playbook Nokia had perfected in the previous era, and rode that free, modern, surging operating system all the way to the very top of the global smartphone market. The throne Nokia abandoned, Samsung simply walked over and sat down upon. That is the cruelest proof of all. The lifeboat Nokia refused did not just exist in theory. We can watch another passenger climb into it and be carried to safety, and then to dominance. The path to survival was not hidden. It was not uncertain. It was demonstrated in real time by a direct competitor while Nokia sank. Nokia did not lose because the winning move was impossible to find. It lost because, having found it, it chose the other way. The losses, in the end, were not only financial. A generation of Finnish engineers, some of the finest mobile talent in the world, was scattered. The factories went quiet. The pride of a nation curdled into something closer to grief. For years afterward, Nokia would be taught in business schools not as a story of triumph, but as a cautionary tale. The giant that was handed every tool of its own salvation and used none of them. So what killed Nokia? The comfortable answer is the iPhone, or Android, or that the world simply changed too fast. That is the answer that lets every executive watching this sleep soundly, because it makes Nokia's death feel like an act of nature, a tidal wave that no one could have survived. But you have seen the evidence yourself. And the evidence tells a different story. Nokia was not killed by failing to see the smartphone. Nokia helped invent the technologies behind it and had touchscreen and internet phones in development before the iPhone existed. Nokia was not killed by a lack of options. It was offered Android, free, modern, and surging. The very lifeboat that carried Samsung to the top of the mountain Nokia had just fallen from. Nokia was not killed by an inability to make great hardware. Even its doomed Windows phones were beautifully built. It made superb devices right up to the end. Every weapon that could have saved Nokia was in Nokia's own hands. The technology, the brand, the manufacturing, the global reach, and the lifeboat, floating right beside the burning platform, free for the taking. The cause of death was not the competition. The cause of death was the decision to say no to Android and bet everything on a platform with no future. The decision to announce its own obsolescence before it had anything to replace it. The decision born of certainty and arrogance and internal paralysis, that the rules Nokia had always lived by would continue to apply in a world that had already thrown those rules away. Nokia stood on a burning platform. It said so itself, and when offered the lifeboat, it turned away, and leapt instead onto a raft that would sink even faster than the platform it was fleeing. There is a lesson here, and it is the same dark thread that runs through every body we lay on this table. The thing that makes you powerful is almost always the thing that kills you. Nokia's total dominance made it the king of mobile, and then made it too certain to believe it could be wrong. Its decades of being right made it confident, and then made it deaf to the engineers and analysts screaming that the world had changed. Its enormous size made it unstoppable in the manufacturing era, and then made it fatally slow in the software era. Its proud independence, its refusal to become just another Android maker, felt like strength, and was, in truth, the vanity that drowned it. The very strengths that carried Nokia to the summit were the weights that pulled it off the cliff. This is the pattern: body after body, autopsy after autopsy. Success is not a throne you sit upon and defend. It is a current you must keep swimming against, forever, no matter how far ahead you are. And the moment you decide that the way you have always done things is the way things must always be done, the water begins to carry you backward, and in the fast-moving rivers of technology, it carries you backward at a speed that can destroy a global empire in just a few short years. Nokia was handed the lifeboat. It was free. It was floating right there. And the king of mobile, too proud to be a passenger in someone else's boat, chose to drown as the captain of its own. They had everything, 40% of the world, the most valuable brand on a continent, the technology, the talent, and the second chance, all in their hands at once. And they lost almost all of it. Not in a slow decline over decades, but in a handful of years, not because they could not see the future, but because they were too certain, too proud, and too slow to grab the one decision that would have saved them. That was the fatal decision. The body is closed, the cause of death is recorded, and somewhere out there, right now, another dominant company is standing on its own burning platform, with its own lifeboat floating right beside it, and telling itself, with the deep certainty of the king who has always been right, that it knows better. If this autopsy taught you something, subscribe and stay with us, because next time there will be another body on the table. There always is. I'll see you in the next examination.